What's going on, guys, and welcome to episode 1000 of WWE Network and Chill here today. I never mention what episode number it is every time I do these reviews, but I wanted to mention here today because it is a very big milestone of 1,000 episodes of this show. We have not only been breaking down Dark Side of the Ring content, obviously, for the last 8 years since I started it, but a lot of the WWE Network content, which is how it kind of started out as, recapping stuff I watched on the WWE Network and other streaming platforms and whatnot, expanded from there. But we've done 1,000 episodes of the show in the last, not 10 years, but 8 years, since the summer of 2016. So thank you guys for the support. I'm going to stop putting the episode numbers in the title from here on out. I wanted to get to 1,000, and then it kind of takes up characters, and then when I write these titles and shit. So I'm going to take it out, but just know that we made it to 1,000 episodes. That is awesome. Thank you for your support. But today we're talking the Season 5 finale of Dark Side of the Ring, Episode 10, the Black Saturday edition, The Rise of Vince. I like how, once a season they do, an event for an episode, because I've enjoyed a lot of the episodes they've done this season. I think it's been a pretty solid season, despite not knowing a lot of the people on paper, like Chris Adams, and I knew of the name, but not really much about his career or life or whatever. But Gentleman Chris Adams, the Chris Cole episode, knew absolutely nothing about him. John Tenta, I obviously knew of John Tenta, didn't know much about his career or him as a person, whatever. For a season that didn't really look all that enticing on paper, they've done a really good job of filling the season with episodes I thought were interesting and really going into the dark side of stuff and people beating their wives like the Sandman, Harley Race. Certainly not the bright side of the ring, I'll say that much. But it's been a pretty good season. But I like how once a season they'll dive into an event like this, or Brawl for All back in Season 2, Montreal Screwjob in Season 1, the Plane Ride from Hell, I think, was Season 3, as was the North Korea event was also Season 3. So they did kind of two event episodes in one season. But I feel like every season we have these kind of episodes where it covers an event and not a person or a career. Because I think this entire season so far, has been about careers and people. Whether they're dead or alive, I think this entire season has not covered companies, but only just people. So it's nice they covered an event to close the season. And I think they did that on purpose because I was wondering why this episode to end the season. And for a couple different reasons. One, it had a lot to do with Vince. And it kind of felt like almost like the series finale for that Tales from the Territory show they did back in late 2022. That was a really good show. I covered that here on the channel as well. Check out all my other reviews of that show. Cheap plug from here on the channel from back in late 2022. But this kind of covered a lot of what they talked about on that show with the promoters working together and the old system of the territories with how it worked and why they all came crashing down at the behest of Vince in the 1980s. So this kind of felt like a follow-up to that, but it also felt like a precursor to the upcoming documentary about WCW coming up next month. I think that premieres on June 4th, if I'm not mistaken. It's a 4-part event. I don't know if they're an hour long each or 2 hours each. I would imagine it's probably an hour. 2 hours seems like a lot. But then again, it's called, it's discussing the death of WCW, which we've heard ad nauseum, obviously, about in the last 20 years plus. But still, they're going to be talking about that starting next month. And this covered a lot about WCW and how Vince owned that time slot on TBS before selling it to Ted Turner and that whole thing. So I think that's why they did it, because they aired a commercial for that documentary during this episode of Dark Side of the Ring, so it made sense. But let's get back to the beginning here. They talk about how back in 1983, Vince Jr. was just an announcer, but anyone who really knew anything about the company knew that Vince Jr. was like the new owner of the company, taking it over from his father, Vince Sr. Vincent Kennedy McMahon is who we're talking about here. They talked about how the promoters met with the NWA every year. They were all in kind of conjunction with one another. That was how the territories worked. And they all kind of knew what Vince was planning around that point. They mentioned how Georgia Championship Wrestling was thriving. Jim Barnett, who was in the head of the company, he was in charge of the company, had connections. They also talked about Turner buying wrestling. He bought wrestling on TBS. That became WCW a little bit later on, around that same point as well. They put together a pretty big roster. But GCW is, I don't want to call it GCW because I'm going to be getting it mixed up with Game Changer Wrestling, the modern day promotion. But Georgia Wrestling, Ole Anderson ran that. And he obviously was diagnosed with MS during the timing of this episode when they filmed it. He's since passed away. They mentioned that at the end of the episode, and I'll get back to that later. But they talked a lot about Ole Anderson on this episode. When they filmed it, they talked to his son, which was really interesting because he knew a lot about Black Saturday and the whole, everything, the timeline of events that led up to what happened and the aftermath. So I thought he was the perfect person to interview since they couldn't talk to Ole himself. He was obviously dealing with MS at the time. Then he passed away soon after. But we hear a lot from Jerry Briscoe as well. He has not been in WWE in a very long time. So to get him on this episode, because he was a big part of it, was key. He also bought into Georgia Championship Wrestling. He bought stakes in the company, and they realized after a while that money was only going to Barnett. He was embezzling funds. So Ole Anderson, I mentioned that he owned Georgia Championship. They kind of summarized what the episode would be about in the first little while before going back and discussing exactly what happened. So at that point, Barnett was still in charge. Ole Anderson was the only one to really say something, and he got in the books when Barnett wasn't there, and he discovered that he was embezzling funds, like I said. So Barnett's wife, who was also interviewed for this episode, says the company was in debt at that point, was Georgia Wrestling. And they recall this story of meeting with Barnett on the top of a fucking building, and they threatened to throw him off if they didn't pass the company over to Anderson. So they get into more stories like that, but that was just how it worked back then. That was how it worked back in wrestling, between that and the fucking blood thing, which we'll get into. Anyway, so Barnett from there, after parting ways with Georgia Wrestling, got into business with Vince. And he and Vince met with the NWA, because at that point, Vince and the WWF and whatever were working with all the other promotions as part of this greater company with the NWA. They gave their resignation to the NWA. So at that point, they knew they're fucking up to something, because why else would they do that? They both gave their resignation to the NWA. And then all of a sudden in Georgia Wrestling, wrestlers started getting arrested randomly or searched. And the police were getting tipped off like, yeah, that wrestler does drugs, or this wrestler does that, or they have this shit on him. And they only knew that because Barnett was telling Vince, and Vince had the connections and the funds to make those things possible and for things to start going wrong for Georgia Wrestling, because him and Barnett were like a dynamic duo. They worked well together, quote unquote, in the sense that they could really take down the promotions and the territories that Barnett was ousted from because of Anderson and everyone else. And obviously they were right to do so if he was embezzling funds, but it didn't really work out well for them in the end, of course. So Vince ended up getting the USA Network time slot from Southwest Wrestling, they mentioned, and how he offered to show tapes of other wrestlers on his show that he ended up wanting. So it was a really smart, and again, they talked about this in Tales from the Territories a few years ago, and obviously in other documentaries and stuff like that. But like, he would offer to show tapes from various promotions that had the stars that he wanted. So, for example, he showcased Junkyard Dog. He ended up getting Junkyard Dog. He showcased tapes of Ricky Steamboat. He ended up getting Ricky Steamboat. He showcased tapes of Terry Bollea, a.k.a. Hulk Hogan. He ended up getting Hulk Hogan. So he taps Hogan to lead the national expansion as the WWF champion in the early 80s. He knew what really no one else was really onto at that point. He was ahead of the game, and knowing that leading distribution with television would really give him the edge over everyone else. So Meltzer had heard, and again, they talked about this, I'm pretty sure, on a Tales from the Territories episode, but Meltzer, who was also interviewed for this episode, mentioned that he had heard that they put a hit out on Vince. Now, he doesn't say for a fact that happened, but he says, I could absolutely believe it. And I could absolutely believe that as well. Again, I wasn't there back 50, 40 years ago, but with the way that things worked back then in wrestling, from the way I discussed earlier with like the throwing off the balcony thing, unless things, obviously things are exaggerated, that's fucking wrestling, and the outside of the business is no different. But I could certainly believe that was the case. They wanted to put a hit out on Vince. So Georgia Wrestling at that point had a time slot on WTBS, and they had the widest distribution in wrestling. But their product started to suffer due to having second-tier stars and second-tier guys, because a lot of them ended up leaving, like I said, to WWF, like Steamboat, Junkyard Dog, people like that. Worse off for them with Georgia Wrestling, their live events were not drawing, according to Briscoe. So the Briscoes, seeing the writing on the wall, the company is going down the tubes, they wanted Anderson out now. So they hold a stakeholder meeting. Anderson walks in at the bar where they were holding the meeting, and they were just straight up with him. They didn't even try to like dance around it. They told Anderson straight to his face, we want you out. He got really pissed about it, so he forces the Briscoes, Gerald and Jack Briscoe, right? The brothers, the Briscoe brothers, of course, and we're not talking Mark and Jay here. He forces them to take a blood oath over selling stock to other shareholders in exchange for regular payouts. That was the deal they agreed to. So if anyone was going to sell stock, they had to share it, they had to tell the other shareholders, they all had to do it at the same time, whatever. They had to be pretty upfront with it. But because, they weren't making any money off of previously, that's why the Briscoes wanted Anderson out and whatever, and they weren't getting regular payouts. So he said, I'll give you regular payouts unless, if in exchange, you tell me if you're selling stock or whatever, was basically the deal. So he makes them take a blood oath, and Gerald Briscoe even said, listen, my word is my word. I don't need a fucking, I'll go back on taking a blood oath. That means nothing to me. But he forced them after 10 minutes. He convinced them to do it, which is disgusting. But as it turned out, Anderson did not end up paying them anyway. It didn't end up mattering. So the Briscoes look to sell to Barnett. They started with Barnett. He says no. They meet with Vince, and they agree to give Vince. Vince is like, can you give me at least 51% of the company of Georgia Wrestling? And they said yes. He ended up owning 67% of the company and the TBS time slot, while Anderson had no idea what was going on. So the Sun says that Ole Anderson was at his grandmother's funeral. So I would assume that was Ole Anderson's mother's funeral and not his mother-in-law. Maybe it was. I don't know. I assume it was just his mother. So they were at the funeral, and apparently that was when this whole thing went down, according to him. So Vince shows up at the office when Barnett's wife is there, and she's the secretary or whatever. And he walks in and says, I own the company now. And she calls Ole Anderson to say, listen, Vince stole the company. He's basically he's in charge now. So Anderson was obviously pissed. They met in the same room, did Anderson and Vince. Vince was trying to convince him, because he was really good at manipulating. I mean, he obviously still is good at manipulating people, to sell him the rest of the company. And Vince said, I'll get you a job. You'll be set for life, blah, blah, blah. Ole Anderson not only said no, but he said, fuck you and fuck your wife, Linda. Or fuck you and fuck Linda. Because he was like, oh, meet Linda? Linda was there too. And I think that's where a lot of the bad blood stems from, between the two, and why Vince never mentioned Ole Anderson on TV up until, obviously, he was mentioned recently when he died. They mentioned it on TV. Vince was out of the company at that point. And I think Meltzer made the point at the time. If Vince was still running the show today, they would have absolutely not acknowledged Ole Anderson's death. And they didn't talk about this, but obviously the Four Horsemen are in. This episode wasn't about strictly Ole Anderson, so obviously they didn't acknowledge this. The Four Horsemen went into the WWE Hall of Fame in 2012. I don't know if it was a case of Anderson not wanting to go in. It probably was. He probably doesn't give a fuck about the Hall of Fame. I don't know if they asked him and he said no, which is probably what happened. Or he would have wanted to go in and they just didn't ask because Vince had bad blood towards Ole for that exchange many, many years ago. Or it was just a case, which is also very likely, of Anderson not being asked and Vince not asking him anyway, because they don't want him in and Anderson doesn't want in. So he was not included in that Hall of Fame induction, which, it's a Hall of Fame. It's the WWE Hall of Fame, which really doesn't mean much anyway. But technically, Ole Anderson, despite being one of the founding members of the Four Horsemen, is not in the WWE Hall of Fame as part of that group. I think it's Tully Blanchard, Ric Flair, Arn Anderson, and Barry Windham. I'm pretty sure the four members they inducted in 2012. But anyway, so Vince ended up firing everyone. They had a Saturday taping, which is why they call it Black Saturday, because they're talking about this specific Saturday. For the Saturday taping, no one showed up because he fired everyone. Vince actually opened the show. The announcer threw it to him. And instead of having a formal show, he aired WWF matches, like his own matches or whatever, any other content in the place of what they were supposed to get that evening in place of the show. But because of that, the show actually fucking bombed because no one wanted to watch that show for other matches. So Vince took over the time slot. It did not last long. Obviously, the Briscoes talk about making a fortune. Gerald mentions that he made a fortune off of that. They were told there was a hitman out there looking for him that was orchestrated by Ole, so to not go out in public or to be careful if they are out in public, which is kind of scary. I wouldn't doubt it. I don't know how true that is, but that's what he says. Ole ended up selling the rest of his shares to Vince anyway. He actually sold the shares anyway to start his own promotion. And Ole ended up getting the Saturday morning time slot at 7:30. Meanwhile, on TBS, Vince's ratings dropped dramatically. It only lasted a year. They had wrestlers on the show that no one knew, that people were watching for typically, so the show fucking bombed. Cornette called it one of Vince's only failures. I don't know if I would call it one of his only failures. That would imply that he's had only a few. He's obviously had quite a few, but that might have been one of his first. Might have been what he meant, I guess. I don't know. So he ended up selling the Saturday night time slot to Jim Crockett Promotions, which obviously ended up becoming WCW, which I think was already WCW at that point because they had the WCW backdrop in that Vince clip of him being on the show. And then obviously led to, the Monday Night Wars years and years later, like a decade later. But he got $1 million for it, did Vince. He sold the Saturday night time slot, got $1 million for it, ended up being worth a lot more than that with what it would become in the 90s, of course. But yeah, he temporarily monopolized wrestling TV. And he used that money, the $1 million, since he had no weekly television at that point, to finance the first WrestleMania that really set off WWE, WWF in the years that followed. So Barnett was still in the company by 1987. Vince ended up letting him go over a difference of opinion. Vince was more modern, which is ironic, because that's not the case in today's day and age. He's more old school or just hasn't really evolved with the times. Barnett was more old school at that point, so Vince let him go in 1987. They recap Vince's downfall. I mean, it's pretty much what you would expect. I'm glad they brought it up because they can't do an episode primarily about Vince without talking about what happened with Vince. Like the whole allegations and not the Janelle Grant thing specifically, because that came out in January. This episode was obviously filmed and recorded well before that. They're talking more about the 2022 stuff and how he was ousted from the company, with people in the company telling him, like, listen, you should not be here. You're not good for stock. Meanwhile, he still owned 80% of the stock. Cornette talks about it. He's pretty much the narrator for the episode. I know it's Jericho, but basically it's Cornette. And he mentions how Vince still owned 80% of the stock. I think he still does. I know I saw that report from Sportico recently saying that he sold the rest of it. The Vince McMahon era is gone, blah, blah, blah. It's over officially. I don't think he's officially sold it yet to my knowledge, but still, it's inevitable. But because he still owns so much stock, he was able to worm his way back in early 2023 so he could sell the company. He ended up becoming chairman again in early 2023 against everyone else's wishes, even though they, unanimously voted against him coming back. So they discussed the comeback, Endeavor buying WWE, and Cornette even fears, like his fear is, now that it's not a McMahon running the company, I mean, obviously Triple H is still there to a certain degree, but he's not Endeavor. They have the final say. They may not care as much about preserving the history of wrestling in WWE. 100 years of wrestling history could be wiped away if Endeavor says so. And, I mean, so far it's been fine. Endeavor has owned the company officially since September. I mean, the deal was first announced in April of last year, which was over a year ago. So far, so good. It hasn't been as bad as I thought it would be with, like, sponsor shit taking over the show. The show's actually been better. I don't know if it's due to them, but that's Triple H's creative vision. It's been so far a symbiotic relationship, partnership, I guess you could call it. It's been simpatico, I guess is the right word I'm trying to look for there, trying to use. It's been fine so far, so I guess we'll see how it progresses, but so far so good despite Cornette's worries, which are completely understandable. But they ultimately call Black Saturday a tipping point in ensuring that Vince would pretty much take over the wrestling world and never let go of that stranglehold. I mean, he doesn't have that stranglehold now. WWE does, but not him because he's not involved anymore. And Meltzer kind of reiterates that, yeah, Vince played a big part in it, and anyone could have been in that position, but no one would have done it as well as Vince. And that really, at the end of the day, whether it was Vince or anyone else, it was cable television that really killed the territories. And they also, at the very end of the episode, put up a quick graphic, like a follow-up that they didn't have time to include footage of, but mentioned Vince getting canned from the company earlier this year after the Janelle Grant stuff happened back in January, getting ousted again from his own company, this time for good. And they also mentioned that Ole Anderson passed away in late February of, I think it was February 28th, right, or 27th or something like that. I think it was late February 2024 that he passed away. So really good episode. Again, most of this, actually compared to the other episodes, I did know a lot of this. A lot of like the career stuff I don't really know all that well. But I thought this was a very good episode, though, recapping the territory stuff. And of course, there's a lot of stuff to be debated, and I'm sure they didn't cover everything. There's only so much you could talk about in a 44-minute time frame without commercials and shit. But I still thought it was really, really good. And a nice history lesson on the business and Black Saturday itself and the territory shit and how it worked. For anyone that doesn't really know too much about it, it's a great kind of introductory point to kind of get them into the history of wrestling and how WWE really rose to the power that it did, specifically Vince McMahon, in his own downfall, which they quickly recap at the very end there. But I thought it was a good season finale, and again, a good precursor, which I assume is why they did this, to the WCW 4-part documentary, which I will be watching and reviewing, whether it's accurate or not. But they have a lot of talking heads on there. We've heard about the fall and the death of WCW for many, many years now, over and over again. And this will still probably be from WWE's viewpoint, because The Rock is involved. And The Rock is, obviously involved with WWE, so I can't imagine they're going to do too much to paint WWE in a bad light, but I guess we'll see how it plays out starting next month. Thank you guys for checking out not only this review, but any of my Dark Side of the Ring reviews this season. All of them are available down below in the description box. Not only the Season 5 reviews, but every Dark Side of the Ring review for every single episode dating back to 2019, over 5 years, 5 seasons of episodes, all available right here on the channel, so check them out when you get a chance. Be sure to like the video, drop a comment, share the video, and subscribe to the channel for more daily content. Have an awesome one, guys. I'm Graham G. Matthews, and I'll catch your ass down the road.